Have you ever heard the term representation gap? Probably not. But that's the topic of today's podcast episode. The representation gap that clearly exists in the United States today. But before we get into that, I want to give my friends at Stars and Stripes a shout out. They are the union shop that I have partnered with to provide top quality merchandise for my website and branded items. And they can also be the shop that you can partner with as well. If you put your money where your mouth is and you believe in top quality, good paying jobs right here in the United States, then I highly advise you to get connected with Stars and Stripes, whether it's an idea that you want to spin off of someone, or you have established brands that you want to really just ramp up the top quality. They are the shop to reach. The description is in the show notes. Stars and Stripes. So back to the representation gap. Now, the representation gap that exists in the country today, if you have not heard the term, have no fear. We're going to define it. Then we're going to describe it. We're going to begin to try and understand why the representation gap exists in the first place. All of these things are going to come out of this podcast. Armed with my show notes right here in front of me, as well as another laptop, because I've got some things I need to read off of the article. So we have a podcast episode on what is the representation gap, as well as an article that is ready to go on the website. It might very well be the next one that's released in tandem with this podcast episode. Let's get started. So, what is the representation gap? Now, we are going to use Oxford Reference, the definition that they put out. And they define the representation gap this way, quote, "The representation gap refers to the fact that a significant proportion of workers in non-union enterprises would like to be represented either by a trade union or by some other form of representative body," end quote. So in a nutshell, it's this gap. It's people who want to be represented or who are and are not. So on this end of the spectrum, you've got all of these people who are represented by a union. They have somebody that helps them, whether it's from a collective bargaining or is their collective interest, right? When we go back and review or watch again or listen to, depending on how you consume the podcast, what is a union? It's a collection of people who have come together and have somebody represent them and their interests. They are pooling together their collective strength and their collective resources to achieve something that the individual part could probably not achieve. And so you have all of these individuals over here who are represented by a union, and then you have a gap. And then over here, you have people on this end who do not want to be represented or are either falling for the propaganda. They have preconceived notions of what a union is, etc. But this gap from where we're at right here to where we get to where people are represented, this is the space that a lot of Americans reside in that wish that they were represented by a union, but are not. This definition going forward in this episode will work quite nicely. Now, why does the representation gap exist in the first place? Why is there a representation gap? This is why I have my laptop open in front of me, because I need to get to a 2022 article in the Harvard Gazette. Now, this is off of I'm reading this off of my article and website that's going to be, kind of probably in the next month or two, whenever this podcast episode actually drops, I will probably drop this article as well. But they write, and this is referencing Lawrence Katz. He's a Harvard labor economist, and he was interviewed about since 2022, we've seen an uptick in organizing drives. and a surge in interest and popularity when it comes to unions in general. And he says, quote, if you do surveys and ask non-union workers whether they would be in favor of having a union in the latest ones, a majority say they would. Yet, union election activity is low. About 10% of all American workers are members of unions. That's because we have a system in which you typically need to win highly contested elections to have a chance of union representation, for the most part. It's very rare for employers to accept workers unionizing without a fight. Over the years, a whole industry has developed of union avoidance and of consultants who specialize in helping employers form strategies to prevent unionization and defeat unions in National Labor Relations Board elections. We can see the reports of the tremendous resources that Amazon put into keeping out unions. I think the general sense is the delays that employers are able to do, the fact that they can, at least implicitly, intimidate workers trying to organize and even fire such workers, has hindered U.S. employees in exercising their right to unionize under the National Labor Relations Act. And the penalties for such unfair and illegal labor practices are often modest and can be sometimes imposed only many years later. E.g., some back pay may be owed once the union drive has been defeated. Thus, U.S. employers have learned very much over the past decades about how to defeat unionization efforts, even when it appears most of the workers want to be represented by a union and desire a greater voice in the workplace. End quote. That is about as succinct and clear explanation about why there is a representation gap in the United States labor force in the first place. We have, in effect, weak labor law. It has been watered down almost since its inception, to the point that if there is an organizing drive, it's amazing actually that organizing even takes place, considering the continual barrage that anti-union advocacy groups sit here and pour into it. And speaking of those anti-union advocacy groups, the estimates of the amount of money that industry makes per year is over $400 million. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself because I'll probably talk about this later on in the podcast episode. But $400 million, even though that's not one specific employer or whatnot, it's still a very large amount of money. And while money might be one of the things that employers talk about as if to say we can't afford it or whatever the case may be because of the money, employers will willingly spend a lot of money to defeat a unionizing drive. To that end, is money the acceptable answer for their pushback? I would say no. And I'm also not the only one who would say no. Indeed, I'm reminded of a line in the movie The Matrix when Neo is talking to the Oracle and he has to get something from the Merovingian and he asks her, what does he want? And she says, what do all men with power want? More power. At the most basic level, when we take into consideration the representation gap, the number of American workers who would like to be represented by a union but are not, and have not put in the, what I would say is almost impossible work of becoming organized, and then we cross-reference that with the amount of money that is spent on anti-union advocacy in order to defeat those organizing drives, we are then left with the fact that employers want to maintain power. They want to maintain the ability and we don't want to be held to a certain standard. Most companies will only do what they are legally required to do and nothing more. Case in point, I am aware that most companies would not provide you with PPE from a safety perspective were they not required to do so. And in fact, I've even been in communication with someone who was up until recently employed by a anti-union firm that did not even provide the necessary PPE, and indeed probably exposed this individual to numerous times of lead poisoning. Therefore, there are even companies that will not do what they're supposed to do, even when they are legally liable to do so. Where am I going with this? When it comes to power and when it comes to representation, there are certain individuals at the core level, we're talking about human nature here, who want power to the degree that they will do almost anything that they can do, including illegal activity, to bring about the structural change that they need to hold on to that said power. This is why the anti-union advocacy groups and that economic machine makes over $400 million a year. It would not exist in a space if it were not desired to come in and defeat these organizing drives, which are almost impossible anyway to win, because they don't want to share power. And yet, especially since the end of 2022, we have seen an interest and a positive light of unions in the American public's eye. It's a very telling thing, which takes me to our next point in this podcast episode, which is, what does the representation gap actually mean? Number one, it's quite clear that a lot of non-union workers would like to be union but are not. That's the whole inference with this, what we call, quote unquote, the representation gap. There are a host of workers who would like to be union but are not. Number two, it's also clear the reasons why these workers are non-union. They'd like to be union but are not. We have weak labor law. If you talk to anybody who resides in this space, and you can talk to somebody that is from a theoretical perspective or from someone in a think tank. You could talk to someone like that if you'd like to. But if you really want to get down to the meat and potatoes, you can talk to somebody who actually does and is in the trenches, boots on the ground, if you will, from an organizing perspective. And they will tell you, emphatically so, just how weak our labor law is. Companies and corporations, oftentimes at the behest of management, who are tip of the spear when it comes to this kind of thing, will break law. They can fire workers. They can do certain practices. It's called tips. Threats, intimidation, promises, and surveillance, TIPS. Those four things are supposed to be illegal, but indeed, many of these things are used, and others like them in said organizing drives, which we might add are often at the behest of the individuals who work there and want to be represented. And they are used, and there is no effective recourse. Indeed, the only real thing that the National Labor Relations Board can, in fact, do oftentimes is, after a lengthy amount of time from an investigative perspective, is order a company to reinstate a fired worker. Well, now you're talking about putting that person back in a hostile work environment. Would you want to go back? This is after the momentum has been pushed down. It's also why I say that our labor law is weak. What's more, to add insult to injury, it's not just corporations and companies that are American born, bred, raised, created, whatever word you want to use. It's not just Americans who are exploiting our weak labor law. Every single southern United States automaker, whether it's the ones that are from Japan, whether it is the ones that are from Europe, whether it's the ones that are from South Korea, it does not matter. Every single one is union in their home country. But do you know where they're non-union at? Right here. And you go and talk to many of those workers, and if it was just as simple as here is a 2-hour or 4-hour, you can pick your time frame, if you will, but here you go, management, state your case. Here you go, union, state your case, and then let the people vote. Then and there, be done with it. You would see millions of Americans become represented by a union and be union members just like that. When in fact, that is not the playbook. And the reason why is because we have weak labor law. And we bring in these anti-union advocacy groups to exploit the weak labor law here in the United States. And we get the creation of the representation gap. And that's where we're at today. So that's reason number 2 when we start talking about what it means, right? It tells me that we have weak labor law, which many, many people who are in the trenches, if you will, intuitively know this. But number 3, it also tells me that there is an increase in union interest. And one would be wise to ask why. Number 1, I would suggest that it's primarily because you are seeing and this is a throwback to one of the previous podcasts I did. It's also an article. You can go to the website if that is the way that you want to consume the content. But it also illustrates a reduction in middle class and an increase in working class. And that reduction or change, if you will, the switch, you got to reside somewhere. And you're going from middle to working class, or maybe you're never leaving the working class to get to middle class. That is increasing the number of people in the working class and decreasing the number of people in the middle class. That highlights a significant problem. It's one of the reasons why data point after data point seems to suggest that union popularity, which is in the upper 60s this year, it was in the 70s last year, depending on who you ask, has continued to rise. It's because people recognize the fact that they don't have any real effective recourse or power except when you come together. That's where you're going to have true lasting power to enact change at your job site level, to be able to say, we want better. We want better conditions. We want better hours. And I don't mean just 40 hours and we want to work 32. I mean, some places have mandatory overtime. And instead of hiring people and putting the onus, if you will, on companies to bring other people in, the current workforce that they have, they go, it's mandatory overtime. If we say you got to work 55 hours a week, that's what you got to work. Or 60 hours a week instead of you working the 40. If you break down, one of the reasons that a 40-hour work week was actually pushed is because at 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, that's a third of your life already spent at work. And companies don't want to do the hard work to find other employees to make your place of work more palatable, more attractive to people. Instead, I want to make you work even more hours via mandatory overtime. That's what I mean when I say we want better hours. We want better notice, no call in, you got to be here within an hour, no questions asked kind of stuff. By yourself, you have little to no recourse. But when you come together with other people, that is the mechanism for change. And the representation gap is as large as it is because those people who would like to be represented have been pushed down, kept down by anti-union advocacy. But it also tells me that entering into the workforce today is Gen Z in larger and larger numbers. And Gen Z is the most pro-union generation on record. This could be for a number of reasons. I primarily think that it is because many of them have bought into a lot of cultural lies. And so they have entered into adulthood as working class members, and they see no way to get anywhere else. They see no way to make it to middle class. They've also seen, many of them, parents and many of their parents' friends go from being middle class to working class. There's only so much you can squeeze people, and you can't get blood out of a turnip. And I think many of those young people see this and they go, whereas anti-union individuals, companies, corporations, etc., realize and understand that there is a comfort threshold to keep people from really doing hard work. I'm just comfortable enough to not push on and to dwindle this representation gap. I want to be, represented by a union. Well, that comfort threshold that they keep people who are in their 30s and in their 40s that have, quote, something to lose. The people who are younger coming in, they don't have that same fear because they don't have much to lose in the first place. And it's a natural byproduct of the way that the economic system has been made or rigged and tweaked in continual twisting, that now you have a whole generation that comes up and they are the most pro-union generation on record. And as some of the baby boomers begin to retire and are replaced with more pro-union workforce, it's going to be an interesting thing to see, because Gen Z has got a lot of individuals coming in that are primarily working class and will probably not make it to become middle class for a number of reasons. And it should not be. And it's fuel to the fire when it comes to organizing. Now, how is this representation gap actually important? Number one, it tells us that the climate in the American workforce today is drastically different than it was 30 years ago. We can even take it back 20 years ago or even 10 to some degree. But it tells us that the climate is changing. It tells us that this existence of the representation gap and this increase in organizing drives, it's letting us know that we've got there's some interest and some changes that desperately need to be made in the workforce today. It also tells me that despite all of the anti-union rhetoric that is tossed out there, the anti-union propaganda, etc., there is an increased interest in organizing today. People want to be represented because they understand that that's the only way to really enact change. It's another way that the representation gap is important from the organizing perspective. Another thing to consider is that people are rightly starting to understand. And this means of being able to use various bits of technology to get the word out. People are starting to come to their senses in that, yes, it is one of the most effective things that we could do is from a governmental perspective, begin to enact law. However, if the law is there and solidarity is not, it's also weak and ineffective. All you need to do is go back and listen to some of the previous podcasts that I've talked about, or you can read a few of the articles, but there are multiple attacks on labor law today that seek to hamper and, in effect, put down many advances for the worker. These are all very, very interesting and unique tactics from people who would like to keep you divided, because united we stand, divided we fall, or we divide and we conquer. They do not want you to be represented, hence the existence of the representation gap. and why it's important. It tells us that we have some weak, ineffective labor law, and we need to bring people together. Which brings me to my last point, which is who is affected by the representation gap. Now, you would be right if you said the people, obviously, who are a member of the representation gap. Yes, you are right. However, the actual existence of the representation gap affects everybody in the workforce. The reason why? A rising tide, in the words of John F. Kennedy, a rising tide lifts all boats. When there is a union around, those who are non-union, there is a distinction, by the way, between non-union and anti-union. Non-union, you're just non-union. Maybe you just don't know. But the anti-union is what it says. You're anti-union. You hate the union. It could be through faulty information, or it could just be through propaganda, but you just don't know. The non-union, the anti-union rather. The anti-union, you know, and you don't care. You've got it out for the union. You hate it. This is where most management sits. When you're non-union, you're a non-represented individual, right? You just don't know. And it's fine to just don't know. It's our job to educate and illustrate what you gain by being a union member or a union contractor or a union employer, because there certainly are benefits. We have to cut through the polemic. We have to cut through all that stuff. But when there is a union and when it exists, the non-union benefits as well. And the non-union worker, this is every industry all across the country, but the non-union worker makes 86% of what a union worker makes. If there is no union, you can be sure, this is one of those things where you can take it to the bank. If there were no union, you can be sure that wages would drop, and vice versa. When there is a union, wages rise. Case in point, when the UAW won concessions for their members, all of the southern U.S. automakers, with the exception of Tesla, because I could not find that information at the time that I did the article and podcast, every single one of those automakers raised their wages. There's a very real reason why. They fear the growing of the representation gap and the uncomfortability that happens when you reside in that space. They're fine with the existence of the representation gap because they help to create it. So long as you can't exercise any power, we're good to go. And this brings me to my last point, which is quite simply this. Our labor law is weak. It's often ineffective. We definitely could use some substantive change. But in the interim, allow me to say this. In the words of Tom Donahue, the only effective answer to organized greed is organized labor. Is it hard to organize? Yes. Is it hard to get from the representation gap, to get out of this space into the represented space? Yes. But is it worth it? A resounding yes. And if you are comfortable staying in the representation gap, then all you need to do is the same thing that we have been doing. In many ways, a lot of nothing. But if you are wanting to get out of the representation gap and you want to enact change, then we have to stand together and live out that principle of united we stand, divided we fall. The representation gap is real. The representation gap exists. And the representation gap needs to dwindle. And this is especially true as fewer Americans reside in the middle class space and more Americans begin to take up the working class space. And that, my friends, is the representation gap in a nutshell. Thanks for joining me on this podcast episode, and I'll see you on the next one.